The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation. Constituency Report is produced as a public service by members of the BC Legislature through the facilities of Shaw TV.
Hi, and welcome to Constituency Report on Shaw TV. I'm your host, Marielle Tounsi, and joining me today is David Eby. He's the MLA for Vancouver Point Grey. Thanks so much for being on the show today, David.
Thanks for having me.
Great, yeah. So this is your last show that we'll be having before the election, and before we know what the future of you holds, whether it's in government or is elected into the opposition again. It's pretty exciting times, hey?
It's very exciting. I mean, I hope to be sent back by the people of Vancouver Point Grey, but you never know what's going to happen in an election, so we'll be working really hard. But it does really make me reflect on the fact that I've been here for 4 years. It went by like that.
So we know that last time in Vancouver Point Grey that you beat the Premier in the 2013 election. And you came into opposition, so I just wanted to know how it's gone so far, what your thoughts are as an MLA, how Vancouver Point Grey is, and what your experience has been like at the legislature.
Well, I mean, first of all, it was great. It was exciting to beat the Premier, but it was difficult to come into opposition. A lot of people thought we were going to win the last election, and we didn't. But I've got to say, being an opposition MLA has been a great opportunity for learning for me as a new MLA. When you're in opposition, you have the opportunity to learn a bunch of different files. I've been the critic for advanced education, tourism, TransLink, liquor, housing, BC Lottery Corporation. So I've learned a bunch of files. I was on the Public Accounts Committee where I learned about the Auditor General's Office and all the reports into various aspects of what government does. It's been a great introduction for me in the legislature, but boy, I sure hope we're in government next time.
Of course. Yeah, so tell me a bit about Vancouver Point Grey. What are some of the differences that you notice now as an MLA, as an elected official, versus just being a citizen there?
Well, it's really interesting to be an elected MLA. And it's an experience not a lot of people get, but I think probably the closest is like being almost like a mayor in a small town. There are so many different events happening that you get invited to, that you get to go to, and especially in my constituency. So in my constituency, I've got University of British Columbia, I've got, which is a huge area on its own with so many things happening, but there's also really active community groups in Point Grey and in Kitsilano who I represent. So there'll be a beach cleanup, and then there'll be a polar dip, and then there'll be a lecture at UBC. There's just so many things that you get invited to, and as MLA you get to see all these different facets of these different community groups and realize how much volunteer work, for example, goes into making all these events possible and making the community a really exciting and fun place to be, for everything from the local BIAs to environmental groups to student groups to administration groups, and then so many local governments. We've got 4 out at UBC alone. So really interesting insights into how a community actually works, how it's built, and how neighbors make that happen. It's been a lot of fun.
Great.
Yeah.
So I know that another part of your job is being here at the legislature, obviously, representing your community, your constituents, and also holding the government to account. So I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are about what's happening in politics in British Columbia these days. I know that you and your colleagues have talked about banning big money out of politics because it doesn't have a good influence. From your thoughts, can you tell me what's currently happening in the system, why it isn't good, and what you think should be done about it?
Sure. I mean, there are 2 big problems with the kind of money that we're seeing in our political system right now. And I know for some of the viewers, they might say, well, this is nothing compared to what they see in the United States. But in British Columbia terms, it's really significant. So the top 10 donors to the BC Liberal campaign gave more than $9 million to the government. So these are big companies and individuals who represent big companies and in particular financial interests. And when someone personally is giving $400,000 or $500,000 to the government in a single year in political donations, it's hard for people outside of that not to believe that that's going to have an influence in what the government's priorities are, who the government meets with, what laws they put forward, what laws they don't put forward. And that impact on people's confidence in how government makes decisions is really corrosive, and what it does is it destroys trust in government. And we need trust in government. We need government to have the trust of the people to deal with climate change. We need government to have the trust of the people to make sure we have a well-educated community, that we have strong public health care. All these things require a strong government that has the people's confidence. And this big money coming into our system makes people think that the government can't be trusted. That's why we've got to get it out of there. We've got to ban union and corporate donations, and we've got to put strict limits on individual donations. So many other provinces across Canada have done it, and yet our province resists. And in fact, we have hardly any rules. You can donate money from anywhere in the world in any amount. That's why you see things like the Premier going to Alberta to do fundraising with big oil. And so if you're fundraising with big oil in Alberta and then you approve a pipeline like the Trans Mountain Pipeline, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone when the Premier gets sued, as she has been in her role as Premier, for making that decision after receiving all these donations from the company doing the Trans Mountain Pipeline project, as well as all the companies that ship the product through the pipeline, almost $500,000. People wonder, was this decision made because you received these donations from these companies?
Of course, yeah. So with banning big money out of politics, I know that the New Democrats have put forward ideas. They've tried to get the government on board to adopt these bills and to get big money out. So what sort of things has the government done, or what have they said, and how have they reacted to trying to get big money out?
It's literally everything possible except get big money out of the political system. So first, we've introduced 6 what are called private members' bills. This is where the opposition puts forward, if we were in government, we would be passing this legislation. Here's the law. It's a bill. It can be called by the government at any time and passed. We've done this 6 times to put strict limits in on donations, and not just for us, but also for the City of Vancouver municipal politics as well. Government hasn't done that either. And so we've done this multiple times, and the government first said, okay, this isn't a problem. People don't have an issue with this. We're not concerned about it. Then it was featured in the Globe and Mail that the Premier was having these private dinner parties where it was $10,000 to $20,000 to sit down for dinner with her at people's houses. Wow. And then it was a bit embarrassing. And then it was in the Wall Street, or in the New York Times, that BC was the Wild West of Canada when it came to political donations. And then the Premier at that point gave up her salary top-up that she was paying herself out of political donations, the BC Liberal Party. She took home an extra $300,000. So she did give up taking home that extra money home, but not before she'd taken home $300,000. And then, now after saying it wasn't a problem, and then having to give up this extra salary, they have introduced a law that doesn't ban these donations, but forces political parties to report in real time how much money they're getting and who they're getting it from. So people know in real time how quickly their government is being bought and by whom. But that doesn't seem to address the issue at all. And then last week, the Premier announced that she's going to do a commission that after the election is going to study the issue and make recommendations about what to do about it, as if we don't know what to do. We all know what to do. We don't need a commission. We don't need it reported in real time. We just need to ban these donations. That's what needs to happen. And the government's doing everything except that.
Of course. I know that's something else that the government hasn't been working too intensely on, and something that you've been advocating for is for things to calm down in the hot housing market that we've seen in the Lower Mainland and now trickling throughout the rest of the province. I know that you've been working quite a bit on this in the House, bringing a lot of stories forward and finding out a lot of information as to what's causing these problems. And I just wanted to get your point of view as to what's actually happening and why the government hasn't done much about it.
Well, there are a couple major issues in our housing market. The first is on the demand side, and actually I think in other constituency reports we've talked about this. Over the 4 years that I've been elected, this issue has gotten more and more important. In the last 2 years since I was elected, the price of a detached house in Vancouver has gone up $600,000. So that's pushed these houses completely out of the range of people who might have otherwise been able to afford that, the vast majority of people in Metro Vancouver. So we have a supply problem and we have a demand problem. The supply problem is the government stopped building affordable housing. The federal and provincial government used to do this. That's how we got affordability in Vancouver, whether it's the West End rental housing building or South Falls Creek around Granville Island. Those were federal and provincial government programs to subsidize affordable housing. The other piece is the demand side. We've got people using our housing market as a place to invest money, as a stock or a bond, instead of as a place to live, and that has to change.
Of course. Now, I know that there's a piece of, that rental housing is a big piece of the problem as well, too. You had mentioned before that there is some legislation that you were hoping would get passed, or that you were hoping that the government would stop certain loopholes and certain things in the rental market. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, there's an array of, we talked about private members' bills, these bills that the opposition puts forward, things that we would change. There's an array of things in the Residential Tenancy Act that we would change. We have landlords that are abusing something called fixed-term leases. So they'll give you a lease, but only for 1 year, and then at the end of the 1 year, the lease is over, and a new lease has to be signed, but they're signing that at a massive rent increase, far in excess of provincial rent control levels. So they're avoiding rent control, which helps give tenants some predictability about how much rent they're going to pay. So that needs to be fixed, and the housing minister said he was going to fix it. In this session, we didn't see any legislation to fix it. Rent evictions, this is where a landlord says, oh, I'm going to do some repairs in the building, I need a vacant unit. They get the tenant out, they paint, maybe replace a couple countertops, and then they rent to a new tenant at a much higher rent level. And Airbnb is a huge issue. We're losing a lot of rental housing. There are a lot of communities across British Columbia that are facing this issue. Local governments need the tools to regulate this short-term rental system to make sure that it's actually serving the community instead of taking away all of the workforce housing in the tourism industry, especially where people need a place to live. So the government needs to be giving local governments the tools they need to deal with that, and they're not doing that either. So we're losing rental housing, people are being evicted without accountability, and rent control has essentially been gutted in BC, and we haven't seen any laws or bills from the government to deal with any of these issues.
Wow. Student housing as well, too. I know that that's a big issue as well. In UBC, since it's in Point Grey, you must be hearing a lot about what's happening there. Can you tell me what your thoughts are with student housing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, just like in the for purchase housing market, in the rental housing market, there's a supply and demand issue there as well. When the government stopped subsidizing the construction of rental housing, we ended up with living with a fixed amount of rental housing, and we have been adding to that stock, even though more and more people are coming to Metro Vancouver, and we're going to be adding 1 million people to that area over the next 10 years. So there's going to be a lot of people who are looking for rental housing, and it's just not being built in the numbers that we need. So student housing is a great example of this. It used to be that universities and colleges could borrow, where student rents could cover that borrowing cost, and they could build a residence for students. But then the government in 2002 stopped that with something called the Budget Transparency Act. They had to get permission from the government to borrow, and the government's been refusing that permission. Now, Gordon Campbell said he was going to fix it. He never did. He lost his job before he was able to fix it. We would fix that. We would allow universities and colleges to borrow to build this housing. They would build thousands of units for housing. They would get students out of overcrowded buses, long commutes from all over the Lower Mainland to UBC, for example, or UVic or SFU. It would make sure that students could live where they want to live on campus, close to where they go to class. And it would also make sure that they're not in the community competing with other people for the limited rental housing that's out there, because they're living on campus. So there would be more rental housing in the community for people who want to rent. It's one of the many common sense solutions about housing that we should be doing, but we aren't doing because this government simply hasn't wanted to deal with the issue.
Wow. That seems like something that should be dealt with for sure. I know that New Democrats have brought up time again that there's major problems in the Lower Mainland when it comes to transit. I know that John Horgan's made some commitments. Can you tell me a bit about those?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who rides transit in the Lower Mainland knows that we have an issue, and anyone, frankly, who drives anywhere knows that we have an issue with traffic and with transportation in the Lower Mainland. So a couple things have been the issue here. First of all, we need a great transportation plan for Metro Vancouver that makes sense to people. We have tolls on a couple of bridges that are driving people to other bridges, and so a bridge sits empty while another one's incredibly backed up. On the transit side, we have a mayor's 10-year plan that's going to take 10 years, it seems like, to get approval for funding to do things like the Broadway subway project, light rail in Surrey. And what's holding it up is 7% of the cost. So the feds have said they'll pay half. The province has said they'll pay 30%. And the cities have said, feds said they'll pay half, provinces said they'll pay 33%, and the cities have said they'll pay 10%. And so we're missing a piece. And that 7%, that critical 7% piece, is holding up this entire project. And so the NDP has said, we'll pay that 7% because we need to get this transit done. We need those rapid transit projects to get people around and get them out of the cars and get them to where they need to go in a hurry. And that's something that needs to be done, not just because it makes sense in terms of the growth of our community, but also to reduce our carbon pollution problem and to deal with climate change.
That's great. I'm sure that transit users and drivers alike are probably very happy to hear that.
I hope so.
Yeah. At this time, we'll be going to the break where David's information will be available for you to see. So please get your pen and paper out. We look forward to seeing you when we return. Hi and welcome back to Constituency Report. I'm your host, Marielle Tounsi. Again with me today is David Eby, Vancouver Point Grey, MLA. Thanks again for being on the show, David.
Great to be here.
Great. So I know you brought some photos in today
of
some things happening recently in your life, so I'd like to take a look
pictures,
at them.
Yeah.
Great.
This is a brand new library in my community, which is Chinese language library. And the proprietor of, it's called Pocket Panda, who's in this picture, has connections with book publishers in China, and she's bringing in these amazing, colorful books for kids. And the interesting thing is that many of the books have English and simplified Chinese, which allows kids who are typically of Chinese descent with parents who speak Mandarin to be able to practice Mandarin with their parents, even though they only read in English because that's what they're learning in school. Now, I asked if my son could come. His parents obviously don't speak Mandarin, and they were really enthusiastic to have kids who don't have any Mandarin to come and learn a little bit of Mandarin in the class that they have. So it's a lot of fun. It's on Broadway, and it's a great little project that they're taking on.
Great.
This is a picture of me with a couple representatives from UBC and University of Victoria. One of the things that happens in the legislature is we get meetings with different community groups that come to talk to us about different issues they're concerned about. We were talking about issues in post-secondary education, making post-secondary education affordable, student housing issues and so on that we talked about earlier. And Kathleen Simpson, who's in that picture just to my right, is the outgoing VP External at the AMS. They just had their elections recently and had a lot of great meetings with her and her colleagues. And so it's sad to see them go, but glad to see the new successful candidates come in, and I look forward to working with them.
Great.
Now this picture with my eyes closed, and the best picture, I guess I was a little intimidated. So this guy, you would never guess it, but on my left is, his name is Da Shan. He's probably one of the most famous Canadians in the world because he's famous in China, and he's famous for being remarkably fluent in Mandarin and exceptionally knowledgeable about Chinese culture, and he does a whole comedy routine in Mandarin with many people, a traditional form of stand-up comedy in China that's wildly popular. He packed a room in Vancouver of Chinese expats who were just swooning about how famous he was. And strange that he's probably unrecognizable to the vast majority of Canadians, despite being, if not the most famous Canadian, maybe Celine Dion or Justin Bieber would beat him out there, but known by literally hundreds of millions of people around the world who follow his comedy in Mandarin.
Wow.
And here I am with 5440, which is pretty fun.
Speaking of famous people.
Yeah, I had lunch with a few of my colleagues with 5440. I was a big fan. when I was a kid, and it was a thrill. Sometimes as an MLA, you get to meet famous people like Deschamps and like 5440, and so a few more Canadians might recognize this Canadian supergroup. And one of the interesting things is they never won a Juno, which is strange to me because they had so many amazing songs and albums. But certainly I recognize them as one of Canada's best groups. And this is a picture, UBC is in my constituency, and this is a picture of medical students from both the Point Grey campus and UBC Okanagan. They just, the senior medical students, the fourth-year students, have just done something called Match, which is where they apply for residency positions after completing their four-year education, where they're going to do 2 to 7 years of additional education on the job in hospitals. And so a really big time for them transitioning. They had an amazing talent show at the Chan Center at UBC where they blow off a lot of steam and they have a great time. There was an amazing pianist and some outstanding hula hooping and all kinds of fun that they had. So that took place about a month ago. They came in to visit to talk about issues they were concerned about, especially fentanyl and the overdose crisis in the Lower Mainland, and their feelings that properly that we should be doing more to respond to that crisis.
Of course. Now, in the first half, you were talking about climate change and the issue of climate change a little bit. You didn't really touch on it too much, but you mentioned it. So I wanted to get into that a little bit deeper. I understand that your leader, John Horgan, and you and your colleagues have put together a climate action plan. So can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the big problem with what's happening in our province around what we're told is climate leadership, but actually looks like a bit of a problem for the government, is that our emissions continue to go up. In fact, they've gone up every year since 2012. And we used to have targets that were set under Gordon Campbell for 2020 for carbon pollution, which leads to dangerous climate change. And instead of hitting those targets, they were abandoned by the government and they set new targets for 2050. So the Premier sends herself off with a videographer to Paris to say we're doing such amazing work on climate change. And then in the meantime, our emissions continue to grow, partially from our private jets, I'm sure. But we need a policy that actually reduces emissions from our province. That's something we have to do. We know that we have to wean ourselves off of carbon-intensive fuels. And we're just going the wrong direction, whether it's in major infrastructure projects like the Trans Mountain Pipeline or just our emissions. So the announcement that was made by John was a really good one. It's to meet the federal requirements around carbon price for all of Canada. We're going to meet those requirements, which is something that the province is not committed to do. And then in meeting those requirements and collecting additional revenue through carbon tax, that money will go back to families in a couple ways. One is the vast majority of families, more than 50% of families, are going to see more money coming back to them under this proposal than they're going to pay in the tax. So it'll be revenue positive for the majority of families. And for the remainder of that money, it will go into funding projects that actually reduce our carbon emissions. This is something people don't know. They pay the carbon tax when they buy gas. Companies pay the carbon tax in BC. That money does not go into reducing our carbon emissions or in assisting people to use less carbon. Instead, it goes to other purposes like boutique tax cuts that the government has set up. So we need to fix that.
Of course. Now, I know that New Democrats as well, too, have recently put out a tech plan, a bit of a tech platform, so to speak, and that you are taking technology and the technology sector very seriously, and that you want to make some positive changes. Can you tell me what's happening there and what New Democrats are hoping to do?
Absolutely. There are a couple issues that have been identified by leaders in the tech sector. One is their difficulty that they have in finding, recruiting, and keeping skilled workers, people who are particularly good at whatever the aspect of technology is that they work on, whether it's coding or engineering or so on. Part of it is the housing market. Our housing is so expensive. When you have people that are highly skilled and they can work anywhere in the world, they're choosing to work in areas where they can make the same or more money and spend less money on housing. Just up the road in Seattle, for example, it's very possible to do that kind of thing. So first of all, we have to address the problems we're having in our housing market to make sure that people can recruit and retain the staff they need. But secondly, we need to be educated educating a bunch of people here in British Columbia for the jobs of the future. And there was a funding commitment to train and educate people in British Columbia for these jobs so that we don't have to recruit so many people from other places, that we can actually make sure that British Columbians are able to get these higher paid jobs that are available in the tech sector, that there are places for them to be educated and to pick up those skills. Really important for us to do, and an area that's been really neglected by this government.
Great, that's really exciting. Now, another area that we know neglected by the government is education, of course, public education. We know, looking at the last election, that we had big promises there coming there from the Premier, but she also happens to be the same person that ripped up the teachers' contracts in 2003, and we know as well now what happened when the Supreme Court ruled that the government was not, they were not following the law and not abiding the law when that had happened. So I just wanted to get your thoughts here. I mean, I know that now they have to comply to teachers, but what do you think that they would have gone through with that? And what do you think that the the BC Liberals think about education? Well,
there's a whole generation of students that have gone through the education system that were cheated out of the supports that they needed, whether it was language training or if they had special education needs, they needed extra attention, they didn't get that attention. If they were gifted, they didn't get those gifted programs that they deserved. And so that whole generation of kids went all the way through the school system, not knowing what a properly staffed school looked like or felt like in their classrooms. And so issues around class size and class composition, where people who need extra attention, students who need extra attention, didn't get that attention. And that's a terrible consequence of the Premier's war on teachers that went over 11 years, from when she was Education Minister to now when she was Premier, when it took the Supreme Court of Canada just half an hour to decide that the government had illegally restricted funding to classrooms for those essential supports. So it's a big problem for students in my community. And then it's not just what's happening inside the schools, it's the schools themselves. I've got two schools, one just on the border, Lord Tennyson, and one in my constituency, Bayview Elementary, that need to be seismically upgraded. Tennyson was promised to be upgraded before the last election, never happened. Bayview needs to be seismically upgraded. And I find it hard to complain because my colleague Jen Rice from Rupert has Prince Rupert Middle School. It was literally built on an old dump site. It's sinking into the dump site. These are the conditions of the schools in our province under this government. It's totally unacceptable. And it's the kind of thing you don't hear about in their press releases, but it's a reality for parents and kids.
Of course. So we have just a couple minutes left. So I wanted to get your final thoughts as to what's currently happening in the province, what you'd like to see change, and how you think that we can do that.
Well, I think, you know, one of the really amazing things about British Columbia is the people, and the second only to the amazing and beautiful land that we're on. So there's so many opportunities here. We have so many resources in our province. When I think about the opportunities that are available for my son, who's only 2.5 and growing up so quickly and going to be in school soon, I want the best for him, and I want a province that we can all be proud of. And I think that that is the real option that we have here. I mean, really, a province where kids go to school hungry, where we're not taking advantage of the economic opportunities that are there, where we're not meeting our commitments around climate change, is not the kind of province that I want for my son. And so I think that we have a great opportunity for all British Columbians, and that's what I think the election will be about.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, David.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you so much for watching Constituency Report. Today we had David Eby, Vancouver Point Grey MLA. I'm Marielle Tounsi, and we will see you next time on Shaw TV.